Good morning. It's October the 14th, Monday, and I thought we'd take a few minutes and walk through the readings that we have for this segment on income inequality and health disparities. Our thesis being that health disparities track income inequality. The more disparate the income, or the more unequal the income distribution is, the more disparate are the health outcomes. We saw some of the argument to support this in the readings last time. Y'all were particularly interested in the Bruner article, I think, and rightly so. It is the biological plausibility for the argument. It is that where stress is high in the ZI, in the context, the social context, then the autoimmune system is impacted. It's the biological plausibility. And as a result, individuals become more susceptible to illness, disease, and even death. So the first segment was about the demographic background, but we included some things having to do with the plausibility. I think it was the second chapter in the Marmot and Wilkinson book that was a Bruner co-authored chapter. And then the article itself, that was a standalone article that you read. This time we're looking at how income inequality, more specifically, affects health disparities. And I want to look at these articles and then look at a couple of chapters in the Marmot and Wilkinson book. Chapter 5, Health and Labor Market Disadvantage, and 6, Health and Psychosocial Environment at Work. We'll just speak briefly about those two. 5 is probably pretty obvious to now, but we'll walk through there and look at some of the figures in Chapter 5. And Chapter 6 is really an extended conversation of the Whitehall study that you have as a reading for this semester, or for this segment, by Marmot and others. So we'll come back to those in a few minutes. I think the main thing with the readings that we're having this segment is they're more technical, I guess you'd say. There's more statistics in the articles than in the previous articles, and maybe not that much more statistics in these articles than the ones that will follow in the next 2 or 3 segments. So it's an issue of getting accustomed to what you see in front of you and not worry about whether you're a statistician or not, or whether you are able to figure out the math that they do, but just to be comfortable that this is evidentiary-based science that we're looking at here that supports the thesis that context impacts health through that biological plausible argument. I want to say that really the thing to do when you're reading these, a good way to do this, the way I usually do readings anyway, is I look at the abstract, and then I look at the opening comments or two, the first few paragraphs, kind of see what the thesis of the paper is, and then I go to the conclusions and see what the findings are. And then that kind of gives me a framework, conceptual framework, to go back through the body of the article itself and sift out of that what stands out for me in the way of understanding what that article's intent is and the evidence that it supports that accomplishes its intention. Of course, I'm a statistician, so a lot of the math makes sense to me, and but I think we can successfully navigate these articles without a statistics background. Some of them are perhaps a little dense around the margins of those tables. Statisticians have a certain notoriety for being, shall we say, nerdy and not necessarily geeky. In other words, not so able to express what they do, although they're quite capable of doing it, express themselves to you and me, I should say. So read the text as best you can. Look at the abstract, the opening comments, paragraphs, the introduction, what they're about, and then the conclusions, and then use that conceptual framework, like I say, to navigate the body of the work and pull out the things that you that you can see that make some obvious sense to you, and not be too concerned about statistics of odd ratios and regressions and things like that, although we'll talk about them here. I think the article that best describes the purpose of this segment is the Robin Hood Index. It is the name. It is about income redistribution. It is, I suppose, in our history in this country, about a progressive tax system, although it's not mentioned there, but it's about measures of redistributing income in a way that more equalizes out the impact of that. And you can see in the Robin Hood Index, when you at that main figure that they have, in the y and x-axis, where you have mortality in the y-axis and the index in the x-axis, that as you move right on the x-axis, mortality increases. So that the farther out you get on the right-hand side, the more unequal it is, and the more it would take, in other words, increasing proportions of redistribution in order to equalize out the wealth. As you get out in those extremes to the right, the mortality is higher, suggesting that if we were more equitably distributed, nations, countries, states, communities were more equitably distributed in their wealth, then these health disparities might not be so likely to occur. So the Robin Hood Index, just in the name of it, because it resonates with us, everybody has an idea about what Robin Hood's about, and I think is a good main typical article for this one. Now, it talks about age-adjusted and age-standardized. The reason that is that way is that, I've just made a passing comment and demographic comment in there, that areas, states, counties, cities, neighborhoods have different age distributions. Some are younger, some are older. And in order to really compare rates where age distributions are so diverse across areas, you have to standardize them. An old way was to standardize them against the 1940 age distribution in the United States, so that you would take the rates of an area and apply them to the standardized population, say 1940 United States, and then see, based on those rates, how many people, let's say, would die from those rates in the 1940 population. And that way those two rates from two different areas, one older, say, and one younger, using that standardized population, you get a better comparison of the impact of those rates. That's what we talk about: age-adjusted, age-standardized. There are different ways of standardizing them. Usually it's sometimes in Bexar County, let's say, we'll standardize against the Bexar County age distribution, so that we can look at neighborhoods rates, compare neighborhood rates against the age distribution of the county, one neighborhood being younger and one neighborhood being older. And that standardized approach gives us a better comparison. That brings the standardization down closer to the geography of interest to us. Of course, that's not so good when we want to compare ourselves with Houston or Peoria, Illinois. We need to find a standardized population that encompasses those geographies, and that's why 1940 and I think now the 2000 age distribution for the United States is used. And of course, we have to think about that, right? Because with the influx of migrants bringing their fertility behavior, and the fact that large segments of the United States population is aging quickly, as is some elements of it growing quickly because of high fertility, we have to adjust. We have to use different. We have to have another standardized national population to use for comparing our rates. 1940, obviously, is not so reflective anymore of the age distribution of the United States in 2013. But that's what those age-adjusted, age-standardized rates are about, so we can get good comparisons across areas that have variability in their own respective age distributions. If you're interested in that sort of thing, I offer a course in the fall of 2014 on demography or population studies, where you look at fertility and mortality and migration and how they influence social dynamics and are influenced by social dynamics. Okay, so I think if you look at the correlation of the index, mortality, the Robin Hood index, you see an R of 0.54, and if you were to square that, which is the correlation you can square it, and that would tell us about 25% of that mortality distribution is explained by the Robin Hood index, which is a significant amount. And that is controlling for other factors that they put in their equation, the authors. You put other factors that are called control in there as a way of recognizing that those controls or those variables on the right-hand side of the equation are influences on the outcome of interest, but by putting them in the model, then they're statistically controlled so that you can isolate out a particular influence, in this case Robin Hood index, on the outcome variable, mortality. If you look at that table 1, for example, there are some interesting things there on the right-hand column that are the R squared, adjusted R squared, but it is the correlation squared. If you look at the one for total mortality, it's 0.27, which means that the Robin Hood index explains about 27%. If you multiply that times 100, about 27% of the variation in total mortality, which is, in social sciences, that's quite an amount to explain. Quite a lot to explain. I'm not saying it just right. That is a lot of explanation for mortality. So it's a very powerful index. And as you go down that column, you can see that there are other things, so much percentage of infant mortality and that sort of thing. You can see in Table 2 that the control variables of smoking and poverty are included in there because we know that poverty influences people that have more income are more likely to have access to health care than those that are poor. And we might expect the complexities of living. Everybody lives in a complex world, right? But the nature of the complexity of being poor impairs the health in a way that it doesn't in the wealthy areas of the community. And so we would expect poverty to, we would assume poverty would, areas of poverty would have a higher mortality. And of course, people who smoke, we would assume people who smoke are having an adverse effect on their lungs and lung cancer and all the other consequences of smoking in the physiology that would increase the risk of illness and death. So we put those two factors that we know are important as controls so that by putting them in there and having them calculate out in the regression analysis, then it, in a sense, removes their effect from the effect of the index itself on mortality. So it gives a cleaner look at the index influence. I talked about the Gini coefficient. I sort of inconsistently disregarded here, regard it later. It's a commonly used measure for inequality. Don't worry so much about how it's calculated, but you'll notice as the Gini goes up, that means more inequality. And the greater the inequality, the higher the mortality. So we would, communities that have high income inequality would have a high Gini index, and as a consequence we would expect as outcomes they would have a higher than otherwise health disparity or a higher rate of mortality. Odds ratios are kind of like relative risks. What those are about, and I mentioned a little bit about this in the notes, and you can go up to NIH and follow that link. It's really about comparing the odds of something happening with an effect on it and something happening without the effect. In other words, what are the odds of, say, survival for people who don't smoke as opposed to the odds of survival for people who have the effect of smoking? The relative risk, shall we say. There's a relatively higher risk for smokers than there is a risk for those who don't smoke. It's just a way of looking at the odds of what are the odds of mortality given no smoking versus the odds of mortality with smoking. Just ways of looking at those kinds of influences. Or in our way, what are the odds ratios of living in a area or a ZI, an area that is high income versus an area in low income, where low income might be the effect, let's say. We might expect that survival would be more problematic in areas of low income. It's just a way of statistically comparing areas in terms of risk that is relative based on the relative differences between areas. The Marmol and Whitehall study is very classic, and you can see how that is. The grades of employment, higher status, grade 1, grade 6, the lowest status, that health outcomes decline as you move from grade 1 to grade 6. And we'll talk about that here in a minute when we look at that article in the text, where he talks about demand and control. The basic thesis here is that the farther down in the hierarchy you go, the less in control of your work environment you are. The farther up you go, the more in control. And the less you are in control, the more frustrated you can be, the more anguished, I suppose, you can be, the more it begins to impact your health. It doesn't mean there are not demands and stresses on those at the higher end or throughout that hierarchy. But the nature of the stress on the low end is that those individuals have a sense of no control in their workplace. And perhaps you've experienced that in your own life, workplace environment, where you carry out the work but have very little impact on actually controlling it. You just do what you are instructed to do. And you can see how, from your own experience, if you've had that, how that would be could have an adverse impact on you. The Kaplan article, I think this is looks at income inequality and mortality over time, and it's a good article. Anything that we have that is temporal, not just simply cross-sectional, but temporal, where we can look at how changes happen over time, then we get a little cleaner sense of cause and effect. Income causing changes in mortality rather than just simply cross-sectional. If we look at cross-sectional and we see areas of mortality and higher mortality and areas of higher poverty, it's an image that we see, but we don't see the causal connection that you see in time. So Kaplan's article gives us some interesting way of looking at that. I think some of the things in the Kaplan article are a little complicated, I think, and I think some of it may be the way that they lay out the tables. They seem reversed to me. And I don't think the text description is all that good either. I think I did a critique in there. But get from that as best you can the idea of the temporal sequences and the impact on income inequality. There's an ecological fallacy section of the article. We've talked about this before, and it's in one of the PowerPoint presentations. And that is has been a controversial point in social sciences for a number of years. To what extent is the health outcome a factor having to do with the individual, and to what extent is a factor having to do with context? And we have always in our country been sort of historically pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, individualistic, and we're not so inclined to recognize group influence and contextual influences, neighborhood influences on behavior. Whereas in England and Europe, that's more a customary thing for them to look at. And if you reside or rely solely on the individual variable, some conversation we had earlier in the semester, that's considered an atomistic fallacy across on the other side of the Atlantic. In other words, it's focusing too much on the individual and not looking at contextual influences. The ecological fallacy here is talking about that there are ways of looking at neighborhoods and areas as properties of the population as such, properties of the area as such. In other words, if an individual family were to move into this neighborhood, they become influenced by the dynamic of that neighborhood. And so it's another conversation, more conceptual than otherwise, but a good conversation, conceptual conversation about contextual impact, and talking about the historical ecological fallacy. The Power and All article, the other thing about the Kaplan and the other Kennedy one is it brings it down. One is at the state level, the Robin Hood Index, brings it down to county level, bring it down to smaller geography, and you can see that the consequence and the explanation and the cause and effect are the same as we move up and down, at least that level of those two levels of geographic scale. The Power and All article relates back to something we read in the textbook, or you have read in the textbook, about social equality and early childhood health and the consequence for children who live in poverty, and even prenatal, that the consequences of that will follow them, will track them throughout their adult, and they have a higher risk of illness and perhaps even premature death from having lived in areas of low advantage or high disadvantage, whether they be state or county or city or neighborhood or even country, since our mortality is not as good as it ought to be, giving as much wealth as we have in the U.S. Rogers' article is an international comparison of income inequality as a determinant of mortality, looking at countries, and you'll see there again he looks at average income for population, average life expectancy of the population, and whereas income increases, life expectancy increases. It just occurred to me to, I'm going to send you, I don't think I have, I'm going to send you a visual here in a few minutes on a very exciting, dynamic way of visualizing income and life expectancy. A very interesting website, and as soon as I sign off of this video, I'll send that to you. So that's really all I wanted to say about these. I'm sure how helpful that is. Look at the tables, interpret them as best you can, and glean your information from the text, and see that this is the statistical evidence of the relationship for income inequality and health disparities. Arguing again from that thesis of the biological plausibility that yes, there is something here. The next segment we're going to take it a little farther and say, well, it's not really the income, it's the consequence of income inequality on social cohesion. If we lose social cohesion in a community or a state or a county or a country, then in that competitiveness there and loss of cohesion, stress increases. So it's not the income per se. It's the consequence for community dynamic that creates the proximate determinant of health. And we'll look at that in the next segment. Let me point out a couple of things in these two chapters. The first one is we wanted to look at is health and labor market disadvantage. It's very straightforward. You can see health effects of unemployment. These are things that you see in the newspaper and read on here on the radio and on the TV. Good health, higher for the employed. Good health is consistently higher than for the unemployed. Self-assessment of poor health is higher for the unemployed than for the employed. A number of figures in here show that, demonstrate to that, and I think it's written well. They use things about employed and unemployed, no car, no central heating, rented housing, issues of living standards that are a consequence of employment status, and for men and for women. Number of interesting bar charts that argue their point. And as always at the end of these chapters, just like in that WHO document, there are implications, policy implications. So as you begin to frame your final paper, whatever that might be, on one of the themes that we've come across here in the reading so far, you want to be sure and address the issue of policy implications on what would need to be done in order to solve the problem that you're talking about in your paper. And we'll talk a little more about that in a week or so when we get back from fall break. The health and the psychosocial environment at work, Chapter 6, is an elaboration of the Marmo and Whitehall study. Draw your attention to a couple of things. You can see explanations of the social distribution of coronary heart disease, and especially as that is expressed in the workplace, which is a main thesis of Marmo. It's not about necessarily the neighborhood. These things can happen in the neighborhood, but it's any context. And since we spend maybe 40 hours, 60 hours of our lives every week in the workplace, and we can see the implications for our health that can come from working in a workplace environment that can be detrimental to our health in terms of stress. Social inequalities in the quality of work and health. Then theoretical models over here on page 100 and 101. He's got the demand and control model, and that's kind of like what they're talking about in the paper itself, the Whitehall study. So that, in other words, as you have diminishing control as you move down the workplace hierarchy, and as a consequence, you have increasing stress, and as a consequence of increasing stress, you have a higher risk of coronary heart disease or other kinds of illnesses, increasing rates of absence from work because of illness, and emotional, psychological stress as well as physiological stress. So you can see how he does that. He has one hypothesis that the lower the grade of employment in the civil service, the lower the level of control over the job, the lower the use of skills, and the higher the level of monotony. So such characteristics may be related to the higher rate of cardiovascular and other diseases in lower employment grades, and then they proceed with that argument, citing a number of references in the literature. And then when you get over to page 115, the effort-reward imbalance model, here they're talking about prospective epidemiological models. The Whitehall was more of a cross-sectional look and looked at proportional distributions of individuals in those various categories and the proportional distribution of heart disease sort of as a point in time, whereas this effort-reward imbalance model is a prospective study, and he calls it a gold standard in epidemiological observation investigations. And there you've got a temporal sequence where you can get a better look at the cause-effect, and exposure assessment precedes disease onset. This is a relative risk and odds ratio again. What are the odds of coronary heart disease if you're in a workplace context that is functional as opposed to a workplace context that's dysfunctional? Dysfunctional perhaps being defined by efforts are rewarded, that there's more control at all levels in the workplace. So there they put together in that chapter some good evidence that elaborates what you see in that Whitehall paper. So I noticed that there wasn't much discussion in this section so far. I suppose that has to do with the more technical nature, but get in there and mix it up. I put in another little thread Friday, I think it was. We'll extend the discussion out for a week. We'll keep the paper and the segment due this Friday, and I think it's this Friday, and get a paper out there, but get into the discussion. I apologize if you're not in the discussion because I've not been in it. It's been crazy for me the last week or two. I've been chairing this 2013 Community Health Assessment, which is my community health practice, which is stuff we talk about in this class, really. And we just had the rollout this last week. And in fact, this afternoon, I'm on NPR for 30 minutes in an interview. So hopefully this week it'll be pretty much have died down, and I can get back into things I'm supposed to be doing, like teaching, which I've not been able to do quite as well as I'd like over the last week or two. And I apologize to you for that. So anyway, thank you for all the good work you're doing, and I will be up in discussion on Wednesday, and hopefully find more of you there. And in a few minutes I'm going to send you a very interesting link that I think you'll find, I know you'll find interesting. Kind of fun to watch, looking at these relationships. And the whole website is all about contextual influences on health. Very dynamic. So thanks a lot, and I'll do another video next week.